I'm here to talk about the ISO on the cake, insights into getting 27001 certification. So a bit of an introduction to those that don't know me. Hello, I am Cairo. My pronouns are she, her. I work on Wajak Noongar Boodja, which is Perth, for those that don't know. I currently do cyber GRC at Octopus Deploy, which is a company I'm going to be talking a little bit about as I go through. And my previous roles have included things like mining and resources, government, healthcare, telecoms, doing cyber GRC for all those kinds of things. I also have a CISP and a Bachelor of Arts Honours. And before I actually dive into my talk, I just wanted to give a shout out to Ian and Shanna for putting this conference on. I know it was a bit of a protest conference, which is a concept I'm really on board with. But it was a protest against something that was happening here in my own town of Perth. And as someone who's been really involved with the cybersecurity industry in Perth, and particularly trying to increase the diversity in the industry, and being the Perth chapter lead for AWSN for 5 years and doing all of this work and volunteering, it was pretty upsetting to me personally to see this idea that there were no women in Perth who wanted to speak or could speak. So I'm really pleased to have this forum to be able to see and share and show that there are women in Perth and all across Australia within this industry who can speak, do speak, and don't apply to conferences like some for very good reasons. It's not just because we're not around. So thank you for that. But I'm going to dive in. I'm going to start with two small things. First of all, I have a slight humble brag, which is that my organization, Octopus Deploy, just completed our ISO 27001 audit in November 2022. I actually submitted this talk before we completed the audit, so that was maybe gambling slightly. We don't yet have our certification issued. We are in the process of mopping up some of the post-audit stuff and submitting all of the evidence to get the certificate, but we should have that in the next couple of weeks. So that's going to be a nice shiny badge for us, and I'm very excited. It's been about a 14-month run-up to actually go through that audit. So this is my slight little humble brag, and I'm going to dovetail from that into a bit of a caveat in that I've never done any specific training on implementing or auditing ISO 27001. I don't have my lead auditor certificate or my lead implementer certificate. I've just read the standard and done a lot of work around the tracks on it. So I'm really talking a lot about my own experience. And particularly my experience at Octopus and how we implemented things for the environment that we were working in. So don't hold anything against me, is basically what I'm saying. So I'm going to start by setting the scene. And this is 100% not a sales pitch, I promise. But how we implemented ISO in our environment doesn't make a lot of sense until you actually understand what that environment is. So to start off with, the anatomy of an octopus. Octopus Deploy, for those that don't know, is an Australian startup. It's about 10 years old. We build a product that manages and automates code deployment. So that's obviously a very highly privileged application that's running within environments, and we're very mindful of that. Our CEO is a developer. He started building this product because it's something that he wanted to use. And we have quite a high percentage of developers and software engineers amongst our employees. It used to be 60%. It's gone down to 50% because we've just hired some new salespeople, but still a very big software developer presence within our organization. We're also remote first and cloud reliant. The company has pretty much always been like that. It's not a response to COVID or something that came in 2020. It's something that's been built in right from the beginning. In terms of company size, it has tripled in the last 2 years. So at the end of 2022, there was about 80 people, and we're now sitting at about 240. So quite a rapid expansion. And a lot of that expansion has been in areas that we didn't previously have. So company was started by developers, lots of software kind of stuff going on, not a lot of support services. So that's the stuff that's been added in the last 2 years. Lots of, we've hired HR, we've hired finance, we've hired a lot of salespeople to go out and actually sell the product while also expanding the existing teams. And probably unsurprisingly, our customers value security, particularly a lot of the larger enterprise customers. Security for them is a very big deal. And as I mentioned, our product is sitting within environments and deploying code updates. So it runs super, super privileged within those environments. If you could compromise it, you could probably do a fair bit of damage. Please don't compromise it and do damage. So that's something that our customers are very mindful of, and therefore something that we are very mindful of. So the big question is, why would you actually do ISO 27001? The first one is, I guess we kind of care about our product and our customers. Weird, right? It keeps all of us in jobs, to be honest, but also no one wants to be selling a shoddy product. And being a startup, it's something that was, kind of a pet project for a lot of the very early people. So there is a high level of care that you might not see in some larger organizations that are kind of big faceless groups. We're also at a point where we're scaling as a business. So obviously going from 80 people to 240 people, you have a lot of new challenges around how to actually manage what people are doing on a daily basis, how to set appropriate expectations around what people should be doing. And we actually start needing to introduce things like policy and process, which is what GRC people like me love to see. One of the upsides of ISO 27001 is it is a risk-based standard. This is one of the reasons I quite like it as a standard, is you can actually put that risk lens over the controls that are in the standard and decide what actually fits into your environment and what doesn't make sense to you. And you can only apply the ones that do in fact make sense. And finally, there is definitely a sales angle. So our customers are demanding it. They want to know that the product is secure and that they have someone else's word for it. There's an independent attestation that there is actually some form of security going on with this particular product and organization. So there's definitely a sales angle to be able to sell to bigger, more security conscious organizations. So I'm going to take you through a few of the trials and the triumphs that I found in the last 14 months of implementing ISO 27001 at Octopus. It's basically what I was hired to do. The decision was made to pursue it in 2020. I came on board in 2021 and I worked with my boss, the Director of Trust and Security, to implement it. It was just the two of us for a big chunk of time. About 4 months ago, we did bring on a third team member, and then it was the three of us heading towards our audits. So there's definitely been some trials, there's definitely been some triumphs, and some of them were not quite what I expected. So hopefully some of you will be able to take away some lessons from this, or some lessons not to do from this. So probably the first thing that we came up against was actually determining the scope of our certification. So the scope is kind of the first thing you need to work out, because that kind of everything else flows on from that. It's what parts of your organization and what parts of your product are you actually going to cover with this certificate. And we had a couple of different options with this. So our product is divided into two. We have a on-premise version of the product, which customers buy, download, install within their own environment. We basically don't touch it from that. We release updates, but it's on the customer to install those updates. And we have no access into it. It's in the customer's environment. They control everything. There's a lot of configuration stuff that they can do. We also have a cloud product, which is hosted within our cloud. And, that's obviously something that we are then hosting on behalf of the customers. So we had the choice where we could go with certifying one part of the product and not the other part, or we could do it all in one hit, which would make the timeline a little bit longer. There was obviously more teams to cover, more things to think about. But we did end up deciding to go all in. And I was a big proponent of this. I didn't want to implement a two-tiered system where we had some teams of developers following particular processes and other teams of developers not having to follow those processes. That didn't make sense to me. And I felt that that would send not the right security message to our people to say, well, this stuff needs to be secure, that stuff doesn't need to be secure. And I didn't want to create any tension between those developer teams as well. possibly creating the idea that some teams were more important than others. We just didn't want that kind of rivalry. We also have a fair bit of flexibility internally, so people do move between teams or seconded to other teams. So having that two-tiered system amongst the dev teams was just going to kind of cause more chaos than what we were actually going to gain by cutting our scope down. It also kind of as I said, the consistent messaging was just really not going to sit well with me. So we ended up going all in. We certified both of our products. The only thing we haven't certified is our professional services wing, which is a very new thing that we only started doing recently, and that's why it's not been covered. But that is more of a consulting kind of service, whereas the products itself is kind of more what we're interested in. So a big one was we'd never done this before, and we'd never really done much in the way of consistent governance across the entire organization. Coming from a startup background, it was very much this culture of, move fast, break things. If we need to come to a consensus, we'll sit everyone down in a room, we'll sort it out, we can just have conversations, which is fine when you have 10 people or maybe even 20 people. But when you're starting to get bigger than that, it's not really scalable. And particularly because we did scale across multiple time zones. So we have people we have people in New Zealand, pretty much all the states in Australia. We've got people in Canada, in the UK, various parts of Europe. It's just not a good way to do things to get people to sit down and talk about it. It's not consistent, and there's no real process behind it. We also didn't have really any kind of standardized policies and processes, even across other departments. Everyone was kind of doing their own thing in terms of how they put together documentation, what they were calling a policy versus a process versus standard, which for any of my GRC folks will know that those are all different things and they perform different functions. And we do try to keep them separate because of those different functions. There wasn't really a lot of concepts of approvers for particular documentation. We also didn't really have consistent risk management across those teams. We did have a lot of teams with quite good awareness of risk and that they should be managing it, but it wasn't consistent across teams. So it was kind of a really big culture change for a lot of this stuff. And it was also something that, sitting down and saying, hey, let's have some governance around things and let's have processes and people need to approve things. It's not really something that startup people are very into. So it's a very big shift, not just in the ways that people were working, but also in the ways that people were identifying. A lot of people who work for startups who are in that kind of culture, they like to be a bit counterculture. You're kind of the new guy, you're coming up, you're like doing new things and, breaking barriers and, you're not one of the big nasty corporations. But we kind of had to come to the realization that we were getting to be a bigger company and we did need to do this stuff. And if we did it right, it was still going to allow us to keep working in really flexible ways while putting a bit of structure and some guardrails around what we were doing. Implementing ISO in a remote world is also a little bit tricky. It has its own challenges. The standard itself, for anyone who's actually read it, it does have a big long list of controls that you should be implementing if they apply to you. And some of those can be a little bit old-fashioned. They're still very much geared towards companies that have their own internal environment that they've set up and everything's on-prem and you've got your servers and you're updating your servers and you're putting antivirus on them. Whereas for us, we're cloud first. We basically rely on cloud platforms for pretty much everything. We buy off the shelf. We use a cloud product. That's how we run a lot of our stuff. Our support channels are all through that. We have HR systems and payroll systems that are all in the cloud. We weren't really working in a lot of ways that could easily be covered by the standard. There were huge chunks that we were like, this just doesn't apply to us, or the ways that it does apply to us is really more in a supply chain capacity where we've outsourced, the data center security to Azure and AWS rather than actually doing that ourselves. So that can be a little bit of a challenge, particularly with auditors who are much more used to a conventional company. It can also be a little tricky doing governance when you're working asynchronously or in a nimble fashion. I'm not saying agile, nimble. But you would think that might not be the case because governance is all about documentation. But some of the ways in which, because we are constantly working asynchronously, we're very much in Slack all day, every day. But Slack isn't necessarily the best medium to be doing document approvals in, particularly with an auditor who just kind of doesn't really get it. So there were definitely some challenges in how we did that. Now, building trust is something that I actually think we did quite well. It's something that I definitely always try to do when I'm doing anything governance related. I always want to make sure that it's pragmatic. I don't really buy into writing policy for policy's sake. I write policies that actually make sense and they actually fit the culture and the work processes that we have. So one of the things we worked really hard about was making sure that the documentation that we were putting together, the processes that we were putting in place were actually pragmatic and were going to work with how people were working. So we did a lot of talking to the teams and finding out how their workflows actually work and where we could kind of stick some of the gates in that we needed, or even just having them, document their own processes that were already existing but hadn't necessarily been written down, and just kind of adjusting how we wanted to do things so we could take into account that, different teams use different platforms to manage work. Some are using Jira, some are using Shortcut, some are in Monday.com. Just so making sure that a lot of those processes were agnostic to the platforms that teams were using, or just accounting for those platform differences in what we were actually writing. The other thing that I'm really passionate about is being able to actually explain the reasons behind why we're doing things. I didn't want to ever really resort to saying, because the standard says so, because if that's the reason why you're implementing something, it means you're not actually doing it for the right reasons. There should be an underlying improvement or a risk that you're addressing by actually doing that thing. So we tried really hard to kind of take people on the journey and show them why we needed to do things and what the benefits actually were, rather than relying on, well, we have to do it because the standard says it and we need certification. So that was something we really worked really hard at. We did find that people were actually really receptive to it, particularly some people who, aren't too happy if you're generating extra work or making them take extra steps to do things that used to be quite easy. But once you could kind of explain the reasoning behind it and the advantages to putting some process around it, most of the time we found that people were really receptive to what we were doing and were kind of coming along with us and actually becoming security champions in a way, because we could actually show them the thought process and the benefit for it. Now, messaging was a really big one. And I know Ian loves it when I include the memes. So one of the things that I do a lot of is security awareness. And that was really useful for doing a lot of the communications around some of the changes we were making for ISO 27001. And one of the key things was really to speak to people in a language that they understand. So really kind of paying attention to what the company vocabulary is already like and adapting the way that we talk about security to those. Listening to the ways that the devs actually talk about stuff and speaking their language rather than using a bunch of nonsense security terms that don't really translate very well. We also used a lot of memes to communicate. I also accidentally kind of tied the cybersecurity brand internally to pumpkins because I did this big cybersecurity awareness month campaign in 2021 and used a bit of a Halloween theme. And I didn't realize how much people were kind of going to latch onto it. But it became super big. We now have there's an emoji in Slack that's like the cyber pumpkin that's at the top of the slide. And everyone reacts to our cyber awareness post with the cyber pumpkin. I don't know how it happened. It just, people decided that they liked it. So I have just run with it. And now I put pumpkins in everything. I also made some weird little memes like that Lord of the Rings one about multi-factor authentication and the second breakfast. I was quite proud of that. I did tweet it at the time because it's one of my fave memes. But yeah, just generally messaging in a way that people will actually understand will save you so much drama, because they're actually going to come on board. And making it a little bit fun is always going to make it that little bit easier as well. So messaging was really important, and this is something that I think we did quite well. We obviously made some mistakes along the way, but once we kind of settled into how to actually communicate with people, it went a lot smoother. So one of my final points, audits are hard. They're actually really hard. No one wants to find out that their baby is ugly. And sitting there in an audit with, two auditors who you're actually paying and sitting there going through and tearing apart everything that you've been working on for almost a year and a half and pointing out everything that's wrong is a very mentally difficult process to do. It was also a very time-consuming process. So for those that don't know, with ISO 27001 certifications, first you have to do an internal audit. You have to do those every year. We then moved on to our external audit, which is for our certification. That's divided into a stage 1 and a stage 2. The stage 1 usually takes between 1 to 2 weeks, and that goes through the actual bulk of the actual content of the standard, which talks about, how you've actually set up your information security management system, and, how do you have your roles and responsibilities defined? How is your leadership on board? How do you actually do a lot of this stuff? And that's, as I said, that's between 1 to 2 weeks. There's usually then a gap, and you've got a couple of weeks. Any findings from that stage 1 audit, you have to remediate before your stage 2. And then you move on to your stage 2. And the stage 2 goes through the 140 controls that are in the attachment to the standard itself. So this is where it's divided into all the different domains of communication security, network security. You've got HR security, you've got incident response, business resilience, and BCP. All of those different categories, and you go through all of the controls in those and show evidence as to how you're actually meeting all of those controls or why you've chosen not to implement it. And that's about a 2-week process. And we did, I think, 7 full days, so 7 days of 8 hours with the auditors. So that was a lot, particularly because we all work fully remotely. So having that much contact and being in Zoom meetings for 8 hours a day for just over 2 weeks is exhausting. And you're also listening to people pull apart all of the work that you've done. So there was definitely a lot of cake eaten those 2 weeks. I'm not going to lie. I was definitely self-medicating with sugar. So be prepared for that mentally if you're going to go through this process. It is a bit of a struggle. The other thing that is a bit of a struggle is you do have to have other people in these audit meetings. So it can't just be your cybersecurity team or your GRC team sitting there talking about everything. You actually have to get different parts of the business to come in and talk about how they're doing those security things in their work. So we had some of our dev teams coming in talking about their secure development life cycles. We had our HR team talking about how they're doing their hiring and onboarding and offboarding. So we had a whole section of different parts of the company coming in. And letting go and letting those people answer the questions is definitely difficult, because I wanted to jump in, and it's probably a symptom of, always needing to be in control, but you're just sitting there a lot of the time hoping that someone says the right thing and hoping they don't say the wrong thing, which also leads me to my next point, which is to actually prep your people. So a lot of our people were really keen to help out where they could, but they were a little bit scared of talking to auditors. Partly because they wanted to make sure they were saying the right thing. Also, a lot of them hadn't necessarily dealt with auditors directly before. And some people also told me they didn't want to disappoint me or get me in trouble. So just sitting down with those people, prepping them around what to expect in a session, letting them know that, they have to show evidence for a lot of their processes actually working. So being prepared with, request tickets or pull requests or stuff like that. Is going to make things go a lot smoother, and just kind of doing a bit of hand holding and letting them know that it's going to be okay. You're there just to answer the questions that you know. If you don't know the answer, you don't have to answer. and just letting them know that they're not actually going to get in trouble if they say the wrong thing. And that last point to keep in mind, it is the job of the auditor to find things that are not working the way that they should. That is literally their job. And if they don't have any findings, they're going to feel like they haven't done their job. Whereas when they do have findings, you feel like you haven't done your job. So just kind of knowing that there is going to be findings, that is why you have an auditor there. It's an opportunity to make things better for next time. It doesn't mean you're a bad person or you're a waste of time or you should quit your job and walk into the woods, which are definitely all thoughts that I had at one point or another during the whole process. And finally, my last point is once the audit's over and you're pretty much ready to get your certification, you're going to end up in this space, which I'm very much in at the moment, which is, what do I do now? I've just spent all of this time and energy building this ISMS, getting us prepped to get this certificate, and now we're about to have it. And then you're like, well, what do I do now? And I don't have an answer for this because this is where I am right now. I can tell you that writing a conference talk will distract you for a while and you will feel a bit better, and it will remind you that you've done a whole bunch of stuff and you should feel proud of what you've accomplished. But working out what to do next is the hard part. So I personally am turning my sights to 2023. I'm writing my strategic plan for next year to document everything my team is going to work on and what we hope to accomplish for next year. And hopefully that's what I'll get to do. But it is going to be a bit of an emotional drop once you finish any big project. So prepare yourself for that as well if you do go through this process. Thank you.